As we move from gathering to listening, our scripture reading today is from the book of Joshua, chapters 12, verses 12 through 23. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir, to Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time, except for the Hivites living in Gibeon. Not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites, who took them all in battle. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israel territory, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So Joshua took the entire land just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Morning, church. So good to see you all today. I'm glad that you're with us. One of the cool things about our church is we have a number of Bible scholars and theologians that I can call on when I get in over my head. And this week's passage, if you were paying attention, is a really, really tricky one for a number of reasons. And so I thought this might be a good week to call in one of our big dogs. And so this morning, we're going to hear from our very own Dr. Mark Patterson. And if you don't know, Mark's been in ministry for over 40 years. He has a bachelor's from Whitworth, a master's from Princeton, and a PhD from the King's College in London. Was the lead pastor of a Presbyterian church in Southern California for 22 years, and now serves as the president of the Flourish Theological Institute, which is a new seminary training the next generation of pastors and church leaders. And he and Linda have been here with us in Bend at Antioch for about the last 2 years, along with their daughter Sarai, her husband Lander, and have become a wonderful part of our congregation. And I am so grateful that he's preaching today, and you will be too. Welcome, Mark Patterson.
Yeah. Pete asked me a couple months ago if I would preach this summer, and I said, sure. And he said, can you give me some dates? And I said, sure. And I gave him 10 or so Sundays that would work for me. And naturally I said, are you doing a series this summer? Thinking it might be Jesus saying, come to me, all who are heavy laden and burdened, and that would be good. And he said, yeah, we're going to do Joshua and Judges. Now, I became a Christian through Young Life, and one of the things my Young Life leader taught me is Christians read the Bible. And so I've read my Bible for 50 years. I've read it cover to cover in various versions, even Hebrew and Greek, for over 35 times, cover to cover. I love the Bible. But I confess I really don't like Joshua and Judges. It's hard to admit before the Lord. I struggle with it every time I come to it each year because of the things that are in it. It's hard. And so Pete says, yeah, we'd like you to do that. I said, okay. Do you have a verse? And he says, there's several verses you could choose from. We have one that we might use that's we've picked, but you could pick whatever. But what I want you to talk on is when God tells Israel to kill everybody, and they're doing that. And if you could talk about the violence in the Old Testament. And I said, wouldn't that be something Jeff Porter would be better at? Or Sean would be good. It'd be fun to see how he could squeeze some dad jokes into the slaughter of the innocents. But I said, naively or foolishly or whatever the case may be, sure, I would give that a try. But as time got closer, and especially as I started reading the passage that's been chosen, I started thinking, would it be easier to preach this or just move to a different city? And even this morning, I got in the car and I'd been working on this. I mean, it's filled my dreams. It's filled my meals. It's everything. It's these words. And as I got in the car this morning, I found my car instinctively turned in a direction opposite the church and started going to the airport. But here we are. I got in here and met Pete, of course, at the door, and he seemed incredibly relaxed. I feel like I'm wound up like a Swiss watch. But that said, I really think this is worth looking at. In fact, one of the things that I really love about Antioch is it doesn't cherry pick verses. It would be very easy to just grab Colossians, beautiful New Testament book, and then you do some Psalms. If you're going to dabble in the Old Testament, let's do some really warm and heartwarming Psalms. And then jump back to the Gospel of Mark or Luke. And a lot of churches do this. They cherry pick. But I love that this church is willing to wrestle. It's willing to take on the scriptures and to say, Lord, what are you teaching us? What are you revealing? What are you making known to us? And how do we respond? And to be mature in faith, we have to do that. When I was in seminary, which was a very long time ago, in fact, just shortly after all the events that took place in Joshua, we had to study a thing in the Old Testament called the documentary hypothesis. And you don't need to know this, know anything about it. But it's a complex theory of how the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, came together. And they drummed that into us. They made it clear that in the final exam, you're going to have to know this backwards and forwards. I can remember getting the blue book, if you remember those old things, and writing the pages on the documentary hypothesis. But I can tell you, after more than 40 years in ministry, being a pastor in a number of different churches, different settings, I have never had a person ask me about the documentary hypothesis. But within months of graduating from seminary and being an associate pastor, I had people come to me and say, I hate the God of the Old Testament, or I don't read the Old Testament, or why do we need the Old Testament? It's because of stories like were just read. It's like the whole of Joshua, or the stories that we'll see in Judges, that they're painful, they're violent, and they're problematic, and there are people who really struggle with these. I'm one of them, or at least I don't enjoy them. But it's important to wrestle with these and to walk through them and to understand them. And so for this reason, we're looking at Joshua 11, 12 to 23 this morning and addressing the difficult passages that we have in front of us, that we might understand what it is that God is revealing to us. And I think this is really important because of a number of reasons. Number one, there are people out in our world, in our city, who won't come to faith because of verses like this. They just don't want to hear, if this is what God is like, why would I be interested? And as a pastor, I've known people who have left the faith because of verses like this. And if that's the case, then we need to know as Christians, not only for our own edification, so that we understand what the scriptures are saying, but so that we can answer the tough questions that are being raised. people outside the church, they're reading these and asking tough questions. And they're looking to us to say, what does it mean? What is God like? And we have to be honest and wrestle with these so that we can give an answer to the people who are struggling with the passages. Now, one of the things that's intriguing is we're really good at just ignoring these kind of verses. I had fun looking through some children's Bibles, getting ready for this, thinking, what do children's Bibles say about all this? And most of this kind of story is removed from children's Bibles. One children's Bible, the only story in it from the book of Joshua is the Battle of Jericho and Joshua and the Israelites taking Jericho. Only story. Everything else is ignored. Another children's Bible had that, and then also Joshua's call to Israel at the end about follow the Lord, choose this day whom you're going to follow. And that was all that they had. And it makes sense. That we would exercise some difficult stories for children, that it's just not appropriate to put something like that in a children's Bible. You think of Curious George, and you would never, you see books like this, a Curious George goes to the movies or Curious George gets some puppies, but you never have something like Curious George and the Electrified Fence, right? There are things you just don't want to give kids, but there are things as adults we need to wrestle with, that it's good for us to wrestle with. And too often we just don't. We swerve around these and avoid them, understandably. I want to tell you just from the very start, and hopefully I've made it a little bit clear by my own revelations of struggles with these passages, is that it's okay to struggle with them. In fact, I think it's important to struggle with them, because there are, at one level, some profound moral issues that are raised. And if that doesn't send some shiver through you or question, then I wonder if you're really getting what it says. But there's also not just moral issues involved, there's theological issues involved because of what it says about God. And we have to wrestle with that, because what it comes across as in passages like you heard a moment ago is that God is the perpetuator of evil, of violence, of murder of children. And that's something theologically we need to wrestle with so that we can answer the questions when people raise them along this line. And so while children might have passages taken out, we want to address them fully. And with this, let me just give you one other thing as we head into the text and start picking it apart a bit. When I have my theology students and teach Introduction to Theology and other things, when we come to a difficult doctrinal concept, it might be about judgment, it might be about sin, elements of sin, perspectives. So there's a perspective called total depravity, and it's pretty dark. Wrestling with that and understanding that, talking about the judgment of God, talking about predestination, election. There's a lot of theological issues that can be traumatic. And I always tell my students that as you approach difficult topics and ideas and difficult biblical texts, that a good principle to approach them all with is to give God the benefit of the doubt. It's not to be in denial. That's a different thing altogether. Is to say, I just don't want to think about it. I don't want to do it. I'm not even going to read it, so I don't have to think about it. It's to honestly wrestle with it. But as we wrestle with this, we say, I'm going to give God the benefit of the doubt and start with the assumption that maybe I'm not understanding this right, or that it means something more than it sounds like, and see if we can get there in the same way. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. And let's dive in. But first, let's take a look at Joshua. And we're going to look at not the whole passage that we just heard, but start with verse 11 and just get a little bit of a summary. And if you go even before what was read, it talks more about the violence. In the two verses before, it talks about violence, that they annihilated everyone that lived in that with the sword in that town. You come to 12 and it says, Joshua captured all these royal cities and all their kings and annihilated them with the sword, as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded. He annihilated everyone. In other places, it would make it clear, men, women, and children of all ages. And also the animals, which might lead some to struggle even more than just humans, but the merciless killing of animals. And altogether, this is a tough passage, but it actually gets harder when we move down to verse 19 and verse 20. It says, no city made peace with the Israelites. They had to conquer all of them, for the Lord determined to make them obstinate. So they would attack Israel. He wanted Israel to annihilate them without mercy, as he had instructed Moses. So we not only have a moral difficulty here of what appears like not once, not twice, but multiple times, a genocidal approach to the people living in the land, a mass murder of anybody who is not Israelite. And that's a moral conundrum, especially when it contradicts other places that the scriptures even say this sort of thing ought not be done, or that the children should not be punished for the sins of the parents. That ought not be done. And yet here it appears flagrantly and bluntly and clearly that that's what happened, that they charged in and killed men, women, and children and animals. But there's the moral conundrum and the moral problem. But the theological problem is when we get to verse 20, it says, for the Lord determined to make the Canaanites obstinate. That God was doing something, apparently, in them that made them rise up against Israel and want to fight. God is at work, in a way, leading Israel to war, bringing the people so that Israel responded in this way. And even more, when we move just barely past that, so that they would attack Israel. He wanted Israel to annihilate them without mercy. Now that is strange, because we hear and we sing even, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. The Bible's full of verses like that. That the Bible, when it describes God, does seem to describe in so many places, in fact, most places, a God who is very different than this God. That even led one Christian leader in the 2nd century, the year 160, so about 130 years after Jesus, to take a very common approach that a lot of people do. And he described that the God of the Old Testament was actually a different God than God the Father of Jesus. He was polytheistic, multiple gods, and that he said they were two. And he's famous mostly not because of that bad theology, but because he put together the first Christian Bible. All of the Old Testament was tossed. Matthew was tossed, John was tossed, Mark was tossed, and 2/3 of Luke was tossed. He liked a little bit of Luke. And some of the letters of Paul, because Paul preached to the Gentiles. And everything else was tossed and left out. It's a common approach when we come to a passage like this and say these ethical dilemmas and these theological dilemmas are so problematic that I'd almost rather just toss the whole thing or even toss the God behind them so I don't have to deal with this. But again, I want to suggest that there's maybe some ways to understand it that are a little different. The thing to look at is this word, annihilated, which in Hebrew is haram. It's kind of like a hard H at the beginning. You'd have to say it kind of with the risk of spitting on the person in front of you. But haram. And it means comprehensive destruction, to annihilate, to totally destroy, to devote to destruction. It can also mean for a material object such as gold, that it didn't mean to destroy it, to grind it up, to send it out like dust or melt it down, but to save it and devote it to God. So often this word is used as something that was not just devoted to destruction, but devoted to God for his purpose. But it was to become, it was a word that describes something to be made into an unusable thing, that it was no longer able to be used or to provide influence or anything like that ever again. And this word is used 2 times in the passage you heard read this morning. It's used 14 times in the book of Joshua, and it's used almost 100 times in either a noun or a verb form across the whole Old Testament. It occurs quite a bit in different forms. But often when it occurs, it's speaking in, just as you've heard, the utter destruction of a group of people. But what's intriguing is when Haram first is used in the book of Exodus, it doesn't have the meaning of killing people. It has only the meaning of destroying false places of worship. Israel is told not to go into the promised land. God says you are going to go into a special promised land, but he doesn't tell them to go in to annihilate the people, to utterly destroy the people, but to utterly destroy their false places of worship. It begins that way in Exodus, and in Numbers, a subtle change starts to take place. That it's still there in those words, in that meaning, but for the first time, it begins to bear the meaning of putting people to death, to annihilate a people. And by the time we get to Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Bible, its emphasis is much more in that direction, the killing of people. But the important thing to understand is the meaning is diverse. It's not a singular meaning that means or requires the annihilation of a people. It can mean the annihilation, and what it originally meant and first meant, and often in its uses past, is the annihilation or the utter destruction of false places of worship. This is important because it leads us to a really important question, I think, as we answer this, and we connect the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament, as we connect the God that we know and that we sung about this morning, of a merciful God that we can depend upon. We connect him with this God who gave these words and used the word Haram. And it raises the question, what on earth is God doing? What on earth is God doing? What is his purpose for our lives? Why did he make us? Does he care about all people or just some? Are there peoples or races that he hates or despises or dislikes or is not invited? Or is it the opposite is actually true, that there is no race, there are no people groups, there's no language that he does not care for? What is God doing? And to get this, we go back to Genesis, in the first couple chapters of Genesis, the creation narratives, and we see there a world that's made without violence. There is nothing violent, nothing evil, nothing destructive. There's no death. There's no children with cancer. It's a perfect place. And what's described as this is God's intent. He made a perfect place, and he parts the waters, and he makes dry ground and a safe place for us to live. He creates the plants, literally low-hanging fruit, that we're fed. There's abundant food for us and the animals. There's peace between us, people, and the animals. There's no killing the animals for food. There's abundant peace. There's abundant resources. And God has set the whole thing up that they lack nothing. But what's really important, we don't understand any in the first 6 days of why did God do this? Was it just on a whim? Was he bored? That's all bad theology. Why did he do it is understood. It's laid out in the 7th day when God made the Sabbath, where God set aside the 7th day and said, I want to do something special in this. And what I'm going to do in this with Adam and Eve, the people he had made, he says, I am going to set aside a day to show you the reality of every minute in your lives, that I made you to have time with me. I made you for a relationship. You know, it's a funny thing, and we don't have time to go into the Sabbath, but it's one of my favorite stories and ideas in the Bible. But God made us, remember, and then he gave us a task. You're to take care of the garden. And yet before we picked up a single shovel or a single shears to go prune the hedge, God says, no. I don't want you to work today. I want you to sit with me and just enjoy it. All of this was made for you, and I am giving myself to you without reservation in time and space. That's what we were made for. You were made for a relationship with God. You were created specifically for that. And it's not just about morals. It's not just about religious rules, religiosity, or being a better person than our neighbor. It's about a relationship with God, from whom morals flows. But what God is doing in this world is inviting people into a relationship with himself. And what he did is he set aside a people group, Israel, to be an example of what that can look like. After the fall and everything went south, he especially needed this people group that when the world looked at them, they could see a different kind of people. A people who had set aside false gods and idolatry and false ways of worship, and they were living the way they were meant to live, walking with him. When we get to Joshua, and there's so much that we have to leave out for lack of time, but when we get to Joshua, we find some interesting things in Joshua. Number one, he talks far more about the Bible, which he calls the Torah, the law of God. He talks far more about the Bible than he does about swords and weapons and warfare. Joshua spends more time telling the people to be people of the book than he does about being people of warfare. That theme goes through the whole of the book. And in fact, when we look at idolatry, we see that he speaks frequently of idolatry and calls Israel to abandon any false idols. The intriguing thing about Joshua is idols are they're not mentioned in the Canaanites in any place in Joshua. In other words, it never is mentioned in Joshua that the Canaanites had idols. We know they did from other books. The only people in the book of Joshua who have idols is Israel. It's in chapter 24. And Joshua, as his end of his life, he says, the Lord has led you into this promised land. And you need to choose this day who you're going to follow. Because you, just like the Canaanites and just like everybody else and just like all of us today, we are pulled relentlessly to false gods, to idols. Luther would say that an idol is anything in which we place our trust, anything to which we turn for comfort. It's easy when we have a good job and an income to find comfort in that. Our bills are going to be paid, our needs are going to be met, we're good. But to find comfort in that as over God can easily turn into idolatry, materialism, different things. And we have this relentless pull towards it. And this hard word, harem, perhaps just suggesting a way to read it, is that it's hyperbole. That is, it's a strong overstatement meant to slap us awake, awaken us and turn us from what's wrong and what's distractive and what's destructive. So, for example, in Exodus, it talks about utterly destroying these false places of worship. And when we get to Deuteronomy, it even goes into the people. But maybe this is Moses' way of saying, you guys sin and idolatry and the pull away from the living God who made you for himself is so powerfully strong and so amazingly, astonishingly destructive, you must fight it. And he uses strong words like, what are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with this idolatry? What are you going to do with this pull? You smash it. You crush it. You annihilate it. You don't let it win. Because you're people of the book. And that's a dominant theme through Joshua. And it's not just Joshua, nor are a few strange people in the Old Testament that are saying this. This is what Jesus did too, isn't it? In the Sermon on the Mount, for example, you remember that crazy verse where he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. Because it's better you lose that than fall away from the living God and face the punishments of hell. If your right arm causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, because it's better to be without an arm than it is to be locked into sin and the judgment that comes with it. Jesus said, if anyone wants to follow me, it's going to be roses and pon-pons, right? No, he said, if anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself. Let him take up his cross. It's dying to self. Paul talked about the Christian life, and it's dying to self. And maybe this word, harem, is a strong overstatement to say we need to put to death the thing that's within us, that's pulling us away from God, and we need to take it so seriously. Because what is God doing? He's made us for himself, and he's fighting that we would have a relationship with him. But there's a fun thing to just stretch it out as we go to the end, is to do one interpretive task in this and to say that the words are not only hyperbole and an overstatement, and we can see how another way that that's the case is by saying, sometimes we use these words in very strong terms in sporting events. For example, a couple weeks ago, you might have seen that the Astros slaughtered the Dodgers, right? Yeah. We did have one person walk out in the first service, so we lost one for that, but it's cost of ministry. But we use that rhetoric all the time, don't we? Oh, we killed them in the tennis court. We slaughtered them. We wiped them out. And maybe that's what's happening here. But another thing to notice as we move out of the Old Testament and this idea of hyperbole is to say, let's look at Joshua through the lens of Yeshua. Joshua and Jesus are the same name. Joshua is Yeshua in Hebrew, and Jesus in Hebrew is Yeshua. They had the same name. And one of the wild things about Joshua and understanding what Jesus did is because of what sin has done, we have all been placed in a realm where we deserve harem. We deserve to be annihilated. But here's the most astonishing thing that allows us to give God the benefit of the doubt. That Jesus, the second person of the second member of the Trinity, the triune God, became human as the man Jesus. And there he took all our sins upon himself, and he became the one annihilated. Isaiah looks forward 700 years, a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. On him, all our sins were placed. He bore our stripes. He bore our wounds. Jesus became the annihilation for us so that no one need ever face that. It's a gift that's available for every single race and every single human being, that God is for us. When we look at the Bible and the whole Bible, when we ask, what on earth is God doing? We see the story repeatedly over and over and over and over that the outsiders are often the insiders. That Ruth, the Moabite, who had no right to come to God, is in the genealogy of Jesus. Rahab, the prostitute, who is outside, that Sean did such a good job describing, becomes in the genealogy of Jesus. You have the Syrophoenician woman, a Canaanite woman in the Gospel of Matthew who comes to Jesus and said, my daughter's possessed by a demon, have mercy. And he goes, I didn't come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Or I came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not Canaanites. And she said, yes, Lord. But even the dogs under the table can thrive on the scraps that fall from the master's hand. And what does Jesus do in this front of this Canaanite woman? He turns to the crowd, to his disciples, to the Jews, and said, I'll tell you what, I've never seen faith in Israel, anything like this Canaanite. And the same thing he said about the Roman that came and said, my servant is dying. Would you come and lay your hand on him? And Jesus said, I'm on my way. And he said, you don't have to come. I'm a man under authority, and I have people under authority in the same way. And I know that all you have to do is say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus says again, I think words that he loves to say, and it says he was stunned, and he's turned and said the same thing. I have never found faith like this anywhere in Israel. The Bible is full of outsiders, Amorites and Hittites and Moabites and termites that are all invited into the party. When you think about the very birth of Jesus, who are the ones that are invited but the astrologers from Iran or Iraq, modern Iraq? Astrologers who, according to the law of Moses, are those under death, and yet they're invited to the birthday party of Jesus. And who's the outsider in that story? It's Herod, king of the Jews, who wants to put him to death. The Bible is a story of a tender, loving God who has made us for himself. And he calls us to relationship. He calls us to live our minutes with him and in him. And whatever is sinful in our lives, anything that hurts that relationship, is to be treated like harem. It is to be annihilated and smashed and gotten rid of so that nothing is made an idol. Nothing replaces him at the center of who we are. The story is a story of God loving the people, or as the scripture said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son so that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. This God is the very same God that in Joshua is calling the people to put to death the idols and put to death anything that would distract them. Possibly Israel took it too far. Maybe they killed people actually, but there are actually verses in Hebrews or in Joshua where towns that were listed as utterly destroyed are still existing with Canaanites in them. And maybe it was just hyperbole. Maybe there wasn't a genocidal program as much as it says. Possibly some. I don't really know. But maybe it's more a story of the God who loves us all, fit together with the story across the Bible from beginning to end, a story of God's love for a broken people who has given himself that we might be whole and calls us to put to death by the Spirit, as it says in Romans, the things of the flesh, that we might live with him and for him in every way we can. It's for that we were made. Amen.